You of course you need a high IQ to be able to do this, but then you play because you've banked additional mana. Then, because now I can play Zed, and then I can stand alone it. You see? You have to have a very high IQ to play Elusives. Alright guys, this is it. This is going to be my one video guide on how to get to Masters in the next week before the end of Beta Season 1 in Runeterra. Now, the reason to get to Masters, or whatever highest rank you can get, maybe you just want to get to Diamond, it's going to be the same general guide, is that when the Season 1 resets, that's going to be on April 30th, in 10 days from time of recording, 9 days from time of posting. When the season rolls over to Season 2, all the players that have reached, you know, whatever the rank you peaked at during Season 1, you'll get a special player icon that is, as far as I'm aware, exclusive to Season 1. And even if it isn't, it's the one time to get it for several months from now. Now, a lot of you guys are probably saying to me right now, oh, Swim, you know, I'm gold or I'm plat. You know, I don't think I could get to Masters. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is not true. If you watch this guide and if you play this deck, and if, you know, maybe you want to watch some other resources, because I do plan on linking some other like videos of me playing this deck where I talk about like my decision making, you will be able to get to Masters. Now, I can't guarantee that you will get to Masters, but this is going to be a quick way, if you have the time, to have a good shot at climbing and potentially reaching that. And even if you don't hit Masters, you can still get the special icon for hitting, you know, Diamond or whatever you end up hitting. Now, the one thing there is that at time of recording, I don't know how long this video has turned out, but it's probably pretty long. I have a lot to talk about. This is a deck that is deceptively somewhat tricky to play in certain situations, although it's extremely easy in others. This is by no means a hard deck, and I've chosen it specifically for several factors, one of those being that it's not hard. But you need to make sure you watch the entire guide here, because this is a deck that, while not being hard, does have to play in a pretty specific way. Now, what's the deck in question? This is my Elusive Burn deck. This is actually a very old concept of mine, and it is basically something that I was playing in the preview patch back in like November. Ultimately, it is several cards off, obviously adjusted for the meta, and you might remember this if you were playing in kind of like the first balance patch update of Runeterra back in like January or February. This was also a very common deck back then too. It has been pretty tweaked for the current meta, but the overall concept is the same. And fun fact, this is also the deck, well, not the exact version, it was, again, different at the time, but the deck type that I climbed to Masters with originally way back in the day, just a couple weeks after, you know, Runeterra launched publicly and we had people climbing to Masters. We climbed to number 5 NA Masters with this deck. Now, why have I chosen this deck? Well, I have done pretty extensive research. I've pulled a lot of Diamond players about like what the meta is like, because of course the Masters meta is a little different from the Diamond meta. There are going to be different decks. So I've done a lot of meta research into like what happens at Diamond ranks and what the best way to counter that is. It's very important if you want to climb to play a deck that is ending games pretty quickly, which of course this deck does. It is a very fast combo deck. So this is, you know, after like several, almost an entire week basically of planning this out. I've been spending a week. If you watch my streams on Twitch, you'll have seen me like mess around with a couple different concepts. I've been doing a lot of scrims off stream, and I have landed with exactly this list, card for card, as the deck that is, in my opinion, the best chance at climbing for the next week until the expansion hit. Now, one thing I will say about this list, however, as a bit of a caveat, is it is high variance. It is a combo list. You do need to draw your cards decently. Not great. You don't need to draw the exact combo every time, but it does have some hands that can dud out, which means you can go on some lose streaks. It's a good deck and it will have a high overall win rate, but it's deceptively tricky, and you do have the ability to just get a bit unlucky a few games in a row. So I would recommend powering through it. I think that because the games play so fast with this deck, it ends up not really mattering, because you just are able to queue into more games and your RNG will average out over time. I personally, just earlier today, when I was streaming this deck for several hours, my win-loss with the deck was 20 wins and 4 losses, and the deck overall in Masters stats has a 64% win rate in the last week. However, it is a small sample size, so we could, choose to interpret that in different ways for sure, but it is a very strong deck. Anyway, real quick, before we get into this deck specific guide, I do want to mention at the end of the day, comfort zone is very important. I think it's a good idea for you to try this deck in this way and see if you can try adjusting your playstyle. But at the end of the day, if it feels just too alien to you, I would definitely recommend trying to stick with a deck type, something maybe like a control deck, depending on what you are personally comfortable on. And for that, I would definitely recommend heading over to, this is my tier list on my site, and pretty much anything in tier 1 is going to be decks that are going to do very well in this upcoming, week, in the last week before the expansion for the climb. So if you want to try something out here, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Everything in tier 1 is decks that are roughly 60% or above. Some of them are like 59% win rates in Masters. These are all fantastic decks. Okay, now we can get on to the actual guide for this specific deck, and I'm going to be talking pretty extensively about what to do in different situations, matchups, mulligans, and I'm going to be talking about how to use different cards in specific ways. Then we're going to go into some, kind of gameplay videos. I'm going to show you in real time how the deck plays and how to win with this deck. Anyway, to start us off on that process, I have pinned in the comments section here the Mobalytics link for this deck. That's going to be how you can import it yourself. In addition to that, if I've made 1 or 2 changes, I think this list is very good the way it is. But over the next several days, I will be playing this list on stream, and I will maybe make 1 or 2 changes to cards, and the Mobalytics version will stay updated. So if I do change 1 or 2 cards, that's going to be the more updated version, where I can't update this video, of course. Okay, so just a bit of an overview to this deck. I'm going to explain I'm going to take something like 5 minutes and explain kind of card by card what each card's purpose here and how it works and the general game plan of this list before we get into complex stuff like mulligans, which are one of the most important things about this list, by the way. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So the main concept here is we buff units that are either elusive or will be able to maintain good buff value. That mostly means Zed, and we rush the opponent down before they can do anything about it, right? So what that's often going to entail is a solitary monk on you're basically never playing anything in the first 2 turns of the game. So often you will play either a solitary monk or a Zed on turn 3, and you'll usually have a standalone on turn 3 as well that you can combine with it. Solitary monk will go to 7 attack elusive off of standalone, and then it is just a matter of having that 7 attack connect with your opponent 3 times. 3 times and you win the game. That's all you need. That's all the damage. That's all the health that their Nexus has, right? Of course, standalone on Zed is a really nice alternative. You're kind of doubling up the value. It's really hard to deal with a permanently buffed Zed that's summoning Shadow Clones every turn. And to capitalize on this general game plan, we run Relentless Pursuit, which will allow us to get in additional attacks, which both Zed and Elusives do very well with. And we run a lot of protection cards. Now, the protection cards are basically going to keep this strategy alive. That's going to be stuff like Twin Disciplines. Usually you're going to be using this for health, but sometimes you can push attack with it. Spirit's Refuge in this case, although Prismatic Barrier and Repost are very, very, very close to this card's power level. I started with Repost in the list, but I'm actually currently using Spirit's Refuge. I found it to be a bit more effective overall. Barrier giving you the ability to keep your units alive. And then, of course, you've got Radiant Strike, can keep your unit out of removal range or push a point of damage. Double Chain Vest helps keep your units alive. Purify, mostly a utility card. Let's get into Purify later. There's a lot of different ways to use this one. And then, of course, we just run a bunch of other elusives. Greenglade Duo, Shadow Assassin, and Navori Blade Scout are going to kind of help tie our win condition together. It's not just one big standalone unit. We're also supplementing with other elusives, and we can kind of keep them alive as well, and just rush down the opponent, usually with Relentless Pursuit, kind of being the most common finisher, but you certainly don't need it. Something really important about Navori Blade Scout and usually Greenglade Duo is I almost never play these cards on turn 1 or turn 2. Navori Blade Scout is not a 1-drop. You do not play this on curve, basically ever. There's one situation you can play it on turn 1, and that's if the opponent plays a Legion Rearguard and they're attacking and you can block it, that's okay. Other than that, never play this card on turn 1 ever. And of course, you're not playing it on turn 2 except for maybe Campunk Pickpocket. Reasonably speaking, you don't want to disrupt your standalone combo. It's usually Monk or Zed into standalone on 3, pretty much always. But mostly, Blade Scout is not a tempo or pressure tool. This is a combo piece. You are using this to close the game out at the end, and you want to save it often, not always, but often for the turn you're using Relentless Pursuit, so you can double up the 2 attack on Elusive body. Okay, then we've got Fiora. I'm currently running 2 Fiora. If you don't own Fiora, you do not have to craft this card. You can run Laurent Protege instead. They are going to do very, very similar things. It's just a 3-mana challenger. Fiora is a bit better though, so if you have the resources, I would recommend crafting her for this job. Basically, the idea here is just having a 3-mana challenger is nice. Sometimes she's an alternate buff target if you're drawing kind of weird. Most importantly, her job is to kill elusives to stop blockers from existing. A very common thing in the meta is Shadow Assassin, so a lot of Ionia decks are all running this card, and it's a good elusive blocker. Fiora can take it down, no problem, and she'll live to tell the tale on top of that, and she just allows your more important units to go face. Additionally, because this deck runs a lot of protection tools like Chain Vest and Barriers, you sometimes do win off of the Fiora game plan. So she can bail out a bad hand where you're just drawing like, you know, not a lot of the other combo pieces. Sometimes she can win with that. Also, I want to point out she's an amazing aggro tool, or sorry, anti-aggro tool, I should say. When you're against an aggro matchup that's like Nox Spiders or maybe Nox Piltover and Zon just rushing you down with Draven, what you want to do is you want to make sure to play a bit aggressively for Fiora. You're usually just going to be able to kill off their units, keep yourself alive, and sometimes win the game off of Fiora in that kind of deck as well. And then last but not least, we have a One of Cithria the Bold. If you watch my streams on Twitch, if you watch me play around with this deck, this is actually going to be a new addition. I put this in pretty recently, but it's a great finisher. Giving your units just a little bit of extra attack and fearsome is going to do wonders for this deck's ability to close games out when it needs to. Cithria is actually such a powerful finisher in this deck that I actually might bump her up to a 2 of. If you want to know whether I have or not, if you're watching this, you have to check the Mobalytics linked because that's going to be the updated version. We'll see. Maybe I will. So now a general overview of the like sort of basic strategy that you need to be using while playing this list, and we will jump into some games and I'll be able to show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and say one of the most important things is kind of deciding based on the matchup how you're going to play, what tools you want to play around. This looks like an aggro deck, and I think a lot of people have this conception of aggro that it's proactive and it's solitary and you don't have to think about what the opponent's doing. And that could be true for some decks, maybe. I don't even know if I would say that, but it's definitely not true for this deck. This is a deck where you do need to know what the opponent's list is, how it works, and what their threats are, and that's going to dictate how you play. For example, one of the most important things, and this is seen as early as the mulligan, but also what option you play on 3, is whether you want to play for Solitary Monk or whether you want to play for Zed as your standalone target. And now I can give you a rule of thumb, which is mostly you want to play Zed against Ionia because they have Shadow Assassin that can like block Solitary Monk sometimes, depending on your hand, of course. You want to play Zed in the mirror match here because Purifies can't hurt Zed, but they can hurt Solitary Monk if you go into buffer. And you want to play Solitary Monk against stuff like Spiders. A lot of like any sort of like Noxus deck will be able to just eat Zed's attacks with their like double Spiders because they swarm so wide. So she's going to be better than Zed there. And again, this should be a decision that you make even in your mulligan step before you even thinking about playing the card, which is whether to play for Monk or Zed. Now, I'll also say you often shouldn't be using 2 standalones on the same target. In fact, almost never should you do this. There are usually better ways to spend your mana. Solitary Monk doesn't need the speed and Zed gets blocked anyway, right? If you have the second standalone, you will actually often ignore it. Just play a second unit. You'll literally brick the second standalone in your hand, but often if they can deal with your first buffed unit, later in the game, you'll be able to activate your second standalone. And of course, if they can't, they'll lose anyway, so you'll usually just be good. Lastly, I'm going to give you a brief overview of mulligan. I'm going to cover matchup-specific mulligans later when I talk about matchup-specific game plans, and that is a really important section for this deck. This is not like nitty-gritty. This is something that's actually very important because, again, this deck needs to play pretty differently depending on what cards the opponent has. So you really have to be aware of different matchup game plans. But overall, the general way this deck mulligans, you want to mulligan pretty aggressively. You usually only want either one of either Solitary Monk or Zed. You usually don't want 2 of one or one of each of them. You just want one of those 6, either one Zed or one Monk. you know, kick anything that's not one of those. Depending on the matchup, like I was just saying before, choose whether you keep Monk or Zed, but mulligan very aggressively. You should be mulliganing away Navori Blade Scouts. You should be mulliganing away Green Glade Duo. You mulligan almost every card, with the exception of either that one Solitary Monk or Zed, standalone, as well as, of course, Shadow Assassin being a card that you can keep, and Fiora in specific matchups if you already have a stable hand and you're not really looking for anything. Now, of course, mulligans are much more complicated than this, and we will go into mulligans for different matchups, but just for the general mulligan, that's going to be it for now. And the final general gameplay tip is, how do we use Purify as a card? Well, Purify is very, very flexible. We can use it on opponents' buffs so that, you know, maybe we can dodge their lethal so we can race them down. We can use it on an opponent elusive unit. If they have an elusive blocker, what you can do is, you know, maybe you've got a 7-attack Solitary Monk. You can attack with the Monk at the same action as you Purify elusive off of their blocker and delete it. It's also great at removing buffs from like the Jeweled Protector against the Kinko elusive deck. You can use it on Crowd Favorite against Spiders. It absolutely demolishes that card. Of course, you know, it's great in the mirror match for Solitary Monk, but there's a few cool ways of using Purify that you might not have thought of. One of which being that sometimes if you don't really think you're going to get value out of Purify, you can actually just use it on a Living Shadow to get the ephemeral, off of it. So you just basically get a 3-2. Now you can't really do this if Zed is buffed, because if Zed is buffed, the Shadow is going to be buffed, and then you're reducing your Shadow's attack. But sometimes using Purify just to get a 3-2 blocker for next turn is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In addition, you can also Purify Frostbite off of your own units. When you're playing against a Frostbite deck and you go in for a big attack and they Harsh Winds you, you can Purify your unit to remove the buffs and, remove all the buffs and debuffs, and you can just get in like something like 4 damage to the Solitary Monk. Caution, when you do this, you're removing buffs as well, so this can only be kind of like the killing blow move to Purify a Frostbitten unit. And the last thing you guys should know is that this is a racing deck. You are simply trying to race the opponent down before they kill you. You need to kill them. What that means is there's going to be a lot of situations where you won't be taking blocks. You will let your health get low, but because you're thinking about all the different things the opponent can have, you will be able to do that pretty safely without fear of losing, even at like 1 or 2 HP on your Nexus. All right. That is the deck overview. So now we can get into some games. We're going to do one thing first. I'm going to say the advanced matchup specific guide is going to be after we play some games, just because I want you guys to have at least a bit of context when we get into this. This has all been kind of like the intro to the deck. You understand how the deck works generally now, play some games, and then a matchup specific guide. But one thing I will say real quick before we get into the games is that it is really, really important for you guys to be very familiar with what your opponent's deck is if you want to climb seriously on ladder, and this applies to any games. One of my top tips for climbing on ladder in card games is just know what the opponent's deck is, right? It's very, very important. So how do you want to do that? Well, be able to identify net decks, like very, very, very common net decks. And if you watch a lot of YouTube videos, that should actually help with that. So for example, you know, if you are queuing into a ladder deck, right, and you see a Karma Ezreal, you can look at a Karma Ezreal deck on my website or the Mobalytics page. That's going to be like the Mobalytics meta tier list, and find Karma Ezreal there. You'll know pretty much card for card what you're playing against. You know, maybe there's usually slightly different variations. Some of them are like 1 or 2 cards different, but for the most part, you are going, like, all the same threats are going to be the same cards, right? Or if you find a list, maybe you see like a, you know, an Ashe Katarina deck, and you're like, oh, you know what? I saw Mogwai playing. I saw him make a video about that deck. And if you see that deck on ladder, when you're in the mulligan, pull it up. Pull up the list on the side and look at the list. Like before you even start your mulligan. You should be playing, if you're playing seriously, you want to know card for card what the opponent has. It's really, really important, I promise, when you're playing around threats. So you can look at any of these resources I have, or anywhere you might have seen the card. If you watch like other content creators, a lot of the decks you are going to see are going to be carbon copies of decks that, you know, people like me and Mogwai are showing off. Okay. So, I'm against 209. That's pretty funny. This is a friend of mine, actually. What a coincidence. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and kind of break down for you guys this game, this deck and how it works in game, right? Okay. So, basically, the mulligan. We've got Pursuit, Blade Scout, Purify. As I said, we want to be mulliganing pretty deep for our options. Let's go ahead and kick Purify and Blade Scout like we always do. Pursuit is a card that I would keep in a matchup we need to be very aggressive against. Usually that's like Ionia is kind of where Pursuit is best, but it might be a little bit hard for it to gain value against like stuff like Frostbites here. So we're going to be kicking Pursuit because we wanted to try to find something like standalone. Very bizarre triple Z hand here. Just messaging me. So in an ideal world, we'd have something like standalone here. Would be kind of the one thing. It's one of this deck's like biggest build arounds. However, we don't, and that's pretty much okay. It tends to get somewhat devalued against like some of the Frostbite decks anyway, but obviously we'd feel a bit better if we had it here. We do have the ability to protect our Zed. He takes the expensive Thermo, which is a concession you kind of need to be taking against standalone. I have the barrier to block, but it's actually not worth it because I need to get value out of these other Zeds in my hand. Like, think about it. Playing the barrier is kind of the same thing as just replaying a new Zed, right? And I'd rather save the barrier in the future than I would save something like a Shadow Shift, which isn't really going to do very much of anything. So we can play this spot a little aggressively. We can go ahead and attack with the Zed here. This is going to either force him to lose his 3/3 for free or level up my Zed. Now, if he has a Brittle Steel in hand, it's really hard not to take it in this spot. You'd want to at least think about taking a Brittle Steel block. My Zed is going to go ahead and flip here, and he's pretty much just waiting on the Yeti. I'm going to slap this Relentless Pursuit off. We are going to get in this early aggression. I'm not going to let him draw into Frostbites or the big 5/5 Yeti to devalue this attack, and this is where the aggression starts. So you can see already, he's at 6 health on turn 4. We haven't drawn standalone, right? One of the things about this deck is, like, don't get me wrong, it is somewhat draw dependent, like I mentioned before. It can have bad hands, but I think it is largely a misconception. I think a lot of people, I've heard some people say, like, this deck doesn't work when it doesn't draw standalone, and you have to play a bit differently when it doesn't, and it does feel a bit worse in some matchups, but ultimately I definitely wouldn't say that it doesn't work when it doesn't draw standalone. I think it ends up working just fine. So we can go ahead and take a block here with something like probably Twin Disciplines. I think we just want to make sure that we are going to be able to get in for value here. We want to make sure we're kind of like killing his potential blocker prematurely. We don't want to use Prismatic Barrier there. The problem with that is it can get popped by something like, you know, Static Shock. It's a little too vulnerable. So we can go ahead and just kind of gear up our attack for later. We don't need the Twin Disciplines in this case for pushing a little bit of extra damage, I think, although honestly that is a bit of a consideration to try to use the barrier first. I don't mind that approach as well. I tend to really be extremely hesitant about the idea of using Twin Disciplines for plus damage, especially against PNZ where they can kind of like turn around and maybe kill him through health. That feels really bad when it happens. So anyway, he's usually going to be on like the Yeti option here. We do have a chance to try to maybe play a little bit more aggressively and blow the game out. We do not have the ability to actually kill him off of this attack, which is a little unfortunate. We can't threaten enough. There is a consideration to play the Solitary Monk instead. We do lose a little bit of value on his Yeti blocker, which is probably going to be there, but we can pre-commit Radiant Strike to the Zed to allow the Zed to attack still. The Solitary Monk will represent a threat that he will pretty much have to do something about. I think, though, that we can do that next turn to effectively the same effect. I don't really want to give him the ability to play a card like Iceveil Archer, commonly used for value in his hand. Now, we have a unique scenario where I feel like I can devalue Iceveil Archer, and the way I'm going to do that is by not developing into my attack turns for the rest of the game. You don't always have the luxury of being able to just avoid developing into your attack turns. That's not always something you can do, but in this case, because we've got, like, you know, the Monk Zed, and we can just, you know, replay them there, that'll be fine. So what I can go ahead and do here is probably would be best is just threaten his unit with the Shadow Clone. Alternatively, I could put him to a little bit of lower health instead. The one thing here is I think his blocker is going to be relevant because of Zed, and we don't have the ability to over the top with Solitary Monk. So I will actually, I think in this case, respect kind of like the slow game plan here. As weird as this is, normally you want to be going in for every point of damage you can potentially get. And we could have taken a bit of a risk with Twin Disciplines there as well. We definitely could have kept that earlier. I wouldn't have minded that. But I'm fine either way here. So this is a bug. This is Zed's card is currently bugged to be like invisible sometimes. But anyway, let's go ahead and play our Solitary Monk now. We get an ephemeral card in our hand, which is kind of funny, just because it didn't die earlier because it didn't get to strike. It's probably going to be useless, but now we can go ahead and play our Zed out, and we can just set up for the defensive turn. And this is kind of what I was talking about, where we have a situation where we can open attack into every attack and make sure a card like Icefield Archer can't get value. We can only do that if we, go for the Zed attack there. Anyway, so this is perfectly fine. I'm willing to let that hit me. I don't have a way to really like trade it off or anything like that. So I am pretty ready to just like re-threaten on my next attack. And because that is leveled up, we also have Spirit's Refuge, which can be a cute way of healing if we want to be racing him down in a situation. Refuge is a really good racing card for that reason. Okay, so he's going to go ahead and take the kind of aggressive get excited on the Solitary Monk. Obviously, we're going to have a lot of options, like ways of potentially countering that, right? We don't want to use anything that could be used for attack, like Radiant Strike and Twin Disciplines in this case, whereas Prismatic Barrier is much safer to use here. I think it's going to be a pretty easy Prismatic Barrier. There's a pretty fascinating consideration to use Spirit's Refuge. I might actually need the extra point of mana later, and I'm not sure the likelihood of me needing the lifesteal. Let's go ahead and so we want to do the math here on how likely that what kind of play line that 1 mana opens up. So we're gonna go to 8, so it's 8 plus, it's basically 8 plus 3, 11 mana, whether it's 3 or 4. So that would be 3 3 4 1. So like deny on top of barrier on top of yeah, I think that's actually enough. So I will actually use this more expensive barrier here. I'm making a very interesting call. I'm basically saying that I don't think lifesteal is going to be important enough. I'd rather have the barrier that costs 1 less mana, because when you do the math, that opens up the specific playline of Disciplines, Strike, Deny, Barrier, which cost exactly 11. And I think that's going to be a very common thing for us to want to play out here, right? There are a lot of ways you could respond to this that would want us to do all of those things, right? So now he's going to go ahead and allow himself to potentially go down to 2. What we want to do is make sure we are threatening him out. So that's going to be done in several ways. I think the easiest way is to start with Twin Disciplines. Overall, this will pretty much force him to freeze me. So the question is, could we potentially take a kill if we bait him into freezing a little bit early? If I Radiant Strike the Zed and he Harsh Winds me here, could we take a kill with Disciplines? Unfortunately, you can't do Shadow Shift plus Disciplines, even though that would be a total of 6 post Harsh Winds. There's no way to do that. So I think I will play this position a little slower and pretty simply Radiant Strike my Zed to make sure that he can potentially stay alive as a threat. I think this has a pretty high chance of forcing Harsh Winds, and it'll do so in a way that is much better than committing Twin Disciplines. So he is going to go ahead and take a bit of a draw here, and you'll note we're also out of Brittle Steel range by taking that Radiant Strike as well. So it's pretty hard for him to keep his card alive, and he's tapped it down to 2 mana. So we can go ahead to, we can potentially Twin Disciplines on attack for Solitary Monk. The one downside to there is he will have the ability to Brittle Steel. He's a deck that's running 3 Brittle Steels and he hasn't used a single one. So it is very, very likely that he will take a Brittle Steel if we go for a Twin Disciplines here. We have a chance of closing out the game. If he has a hand state that doesn't have Brittle Steel, are we too worried? His Ezreal is only 4 out of 8. I don't think we actually have to give any value at all to Brittle Steel. I think we usually have positions here where we can avoid it, especially when we use Twin Disciplines for attack for health buff later. So I will actually, I think I will make a bit of an unusual call to not take this, because wow, that's so close, man. It's like we have a chance of just winning the game on the spot. I'll take it. I'll take it. This is huge. It's like 70% Brittle Steel here, really high. But we have a good chance of winning the game on the spot. It's a little too hard to not take. Now the play is like, because he has no pressure on us, the reason I might not have taken that is because he has no pressure on us whatsoever. His Ezreal's 4 out of 8. He's out of mana. We've just won the board with a Radiant Strike. We don't necessarily need to take a risk like that, and we have a hand that could maybe devalue Brittle Steel in the future. But at the end of the day, it's just a little too juicy to not take. Okay, so we get into another game here. We are against an aggressive deck. This is Jinx Draven, and they're running Katarina as well. We happen to have a pretty good hand. Look at that. So the question is, would you keep Zed or Solitary Monk? That's the first thing you have to ask yourself here. Well, we could race them down with Solitary Monk pretty well. They don't tend to run a lot of chump blockers, but if it's like a full discard version, they could be running like Jury Rigs and Flame Chompers. I don't necessarily expect that, but if he is running that, that could be pretty scary. Or we could just do a race with Solitary Monk, which could be a little bit more stable. It's actually pretty close, but I think I will just go for the Solitary Monk game plan, especially because we have the Relentless Pursuit as well. Zed gets blocked, and his ability to... His ability against aggro is to kind of like make sure that they can't attack into him very well either by forcing... He kind of taxes their units, right? They have to sacrifice units into Zed to stay alive. But if he is running a discard heavy version of the deck like Chompers and Jury Rig, I feel like in this case I'm taking a bit of an unnecessary risk there with Zed. Whereas Solitary Monk will almost guaranteed kill him very quickly. And we can race him down with Spirit's Refuge as well. This is a very, very important tool in the aggro matchup. If you're just in a race situation, this is usually going to heal you for 7 here, right? Okay, so next turn we've got Monk standalone attack. And of course, the Pursuit's going to follow. So last chance to change our plans with Zed, but the biggest fan is going to make our plans definitely more leaned into this. And again, the most important thing is he's not running Ionia, which means he doesn't have the elusive blocker that would make Solitary Monk a little bit more awkward, right? So Solitary Monk is just going to be fine. He's not running Purify. Purify is really rare in the meta. Some Demacia decks do run it. You will see it in the mirror, of course, and in the mirror match for this deck, you will have to buff Zed with Standalone to play around Purify because they can't Purify off Zed. But unless it's Ionia, usually Solitary Monk can race them down a little bit more reliably than Zed. Although, to be honest, it's very, very close. It's very close. Okay, so we have turn 5 lethal here off of the Relentless Pursuit. It looks like he's not really on great options. And of course, we have our own Chain Vest. So there's not too much he could do. We want to make sure we're playing around his scary ranges, right? Now he is a pretty classic. Let's go ahead and assume this is pretty close to a burn list, right? Now we don't know exactly what it is card for card because it's running Katarina, but again, like I was saying, you just want to make sure you're looking at the deck and pulling it up. So let's go ahead and look at the site. Let's go, oh, sorry, not burn Ezreal, I misclicked. Let's go into burn discard aggro. So his list is going to be something pretty similar to this. We expect a lot of the same threats. So like Get Excited, Mystic Shot, potentially like Legion Grenadier, Decimate. We want to make sure we're playing outside of those ranges, right? There's Saboteur there, but that's not his list card for card, right? It's much more helpful when you do have their list card for card and you can't do that. We should just be able to, I think, go ahead and pass here. I don't think he's threatening like way too much off this attack or anything. I don't mind taking something like a defensive Spirit's Refuge depending on how he attacks. Yeah, there's the Grenadier. So in theory, I mean, if I did want to slow him down, I probably could here. I don't think there's much of a reason for me to dedicate an extra blocker. I'm mostly just looking for Refuge and Relentless Pursuit for the turn 5 kill. I don't know if his deck's going to have any way to stop that. He has no particular way to like punish me for blocking the Draven out here, so we can just do this. He doesn't really have at 1 mana an answer to Spirit's Refuge, so we have the ability to just do this as well. We're overhealing for 2, but in this case it doesn't really matter. We're eliminating a threat and we're not like tapping ourselves out of any mana that's going to be doing anything specific. Oh no, wait, we're not sorry, I thought we were overhealing, but yeah, the damage off of Boom Crew and Saboteur goes off first. Yeah, we don't overheal at all. So it's turn 5. We have 14 damage on this turn, and we're staring down an opponent with 13 health. So it's very unfortunate for him, but it does look like he has lost this game. It would be pretty funny a Thermo come down here. We obviously have the way to kill him through Thermo. Usually it's pursuit into the concede line. His deck has no way of dealing with this. No way at all. There's no single card that his deck is going to be running that would allow him to survive here, right? Like, there's no single card that kills me. There's no card that kills Monk, resets Monk. There's no elusive blocker. There's no heal. There's no single card, right? That's all. Yeah, that's basically all he can do. Yeah, this is kind of the idea behind when this deck is able to draw good, and when it has the early aggression, you can win any race. Now, we could have played that in many different ways. There's honestly some arguments to have played Zed there instead of Monk. All right. And now we get into a mirror match. Now, this one's kind of funny. At the end of the day, I will say this mirror match is really, truly degenerate. This is like pure RNG, basically. So attacking on odds gives him a huge advantage. And if I find standalone and he doesn't, then I'm good. You hard mulligan for Zed standalone and purify, and almost nothing matters. Almost nothing else could possibly matter. Whoever draws better wins, period, almost like straight up. So I've got pursuit, but that's kind of useless without standalone in this matchup. I mostly am I'm hoping that he didn't draw Zed, so he'll be forced to buff a Monk, and that I can win with purify, removing like a big buffed Monk. That's basically it. I have standalone, but I'm not attacking on odds. So if he has Zed standalone, we can't win. If he is attacking on odds and he has Zed standalone, there's no way we can win the game. So he has Zed. The question is, does he have standalone? Because if there is, there shouldn't be a way to win this game. You know what? He did tap under standalone, right? So even if he could have drawn it, he wouldn't be able to play it now. I wonder if he just misplayed that. Because normally, I kind of like didn't even register he like tapped out from standalone. Because this deck is kind of never supposed to do that Blade Scout attack on 1. It's pretty much always wrong to be doing that. So he either drew, so here's the thing, even if he didn't draw standalone, you still shouldn't make that play. You still should pretty much assume that you are about to draw standalone, right? So again, we are going to go ahead and evaluate every threat, just like we did last game, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and pull up our page. We're gonna look at the deck and we're gonna look card for card. He has 2 mana. What could he play here? What's the scare card? Well, he could play double Radiant Strike, right? He could play double Radiant Strike. So if we do a block like this and he has double Radiant Strike, that's actually a little scary. It's a specific hand, but I will auto lose if that happens. And because he's kind of messed up his standalone, I don't think I have to do that, right? So what I could do is just block this card and play around that option, that 2-card combo. He doesn't have enough mana for Twin Disciplines, so we're pretty safe to do this. Now, here's the thing. His Zed is going to level up, which is okay. That doesn't matter to me. And he could have standalone that we're enabling by killing the Blade Boy. But none of that matters because we have standalone and we are the ones attacking now. On top of that, we also have Relentless Pursuit, so he might not actually be able to survive an attack without designating a blocker that, you know, he wouldn't really want to designate, right? Right. Like if he pretty much is forced to not block with his Zed. It's too integral to his win condition here. Or he could try to take like a standalone Twin Disciplines block and then we'd win with our Twin Disciplines for attack. Or like double Twin Disciplines block. We tend to have answers for most things he could do here, right? We're kind of the ones that are setting the pace for this game. And if he does nothing and spends his mana, then he's down to 8 and we can Relentless Pursuit as well. So now our Zed levels. And again, this is just like, this is a really stupid matchup. This is the dumbest mirror match in the entire game. So now it just comes down to what he plays. If he plays his own Relentless Pursuit from hand, that is a big mistake. Because I can counter it with mine, and because his takes an action, but mine is a response at fast speed, I'd get the attack first, and I'd swing into him and threaten the game, and he wouldn't have mana for deny. So he can't take a pursuit now. If he taps out under deny, I will probably take a pursuit pretty much no matter what else happens. He's at 1 mana, which means he's not really going to be looking to do too much. I think I will actually be able to get value out of a Blade Scout here. It will make it a little bit harder for him to potentially try to stay alive, and he's in the same spot. Whereas if he tries to take the pursuit now, maybe he thinks he's safe because I just tapped out under deny. If he takes the pursuit first, he will lose. Now here's the problem. The same applies to me. If I take pursuit right now, and then he plays his own pursuit, he gets to attack first. Because I've used my pursuit with an action, but his just changed to mine. So his action goes first. So the question is, am I okay with him attacking first? Am I okay with that? The answer, interestingly enough, is often yes. So if I take the pursuit now, and he pursuits back, his Shadow Assassin will attack, I'll block with Blade Scout, and his Zed will be able to shove into me for 8. I'll go down to 4. My Zed will then counterattack, and put him to 1 health, and then he'll go into the next turn and kill me probably over the top with an elusive. I actually don't think I can do that. I actually don't think I can do all that. The question is, are we good to be able to beat him if he doesn't have pursuit? Or sorry, if he does have pursuit and we don't do that? And I think the answer to that is yes. I actually have a pretty safe hand here. We have a lot of answers to different things he could do here, and we have a chump blocker for Zed as well. If he tries to do anything committal, like, we can counter with our Relentless Pursuit here. But I think I have a hand that can beat a Relentless Pursuit option that he could have, right? Now, you don't want to do this kind of play when you feel like you're not in control of the game, basically. It's only something you really wanted to do when you do feel like you have control over the game, right? When you do feel like you're going to be fine. And I think I can probably be fine here. I don't think I'm very afraid of his, like... Because the thing is, it's a non-standalone Zed, right? It's not that big of a threat here. So he's pre-committing the Discipline of Force. Okay? So we are going to be able to basically start chumping this out. So what that's going to mean is something like this, right? We would, in theory, go down to 3 if this happens. So again, what we're going to do, and we're going to do this every time, is we're going to look at the options. Okay, so we're going down to 3. If we block like this, he has 2 mana. What's going to happen? He could Purify. He could double Radiant Strike. That's about it. He can do Chain Vest to, like, keep something alive. But at 2 mana, that's pretty hard. And there's nothing that can be purified here for value. He could develop a blocker, which I'm going to stop with my committed Relentless Pursuit here. He could Purify his Shadow and get a blocker. That's kind of one adorable thing he could do. But I'm going to go ahead and take my own Relentless Pursuit here, right? And this is going to effectively allow me to respond with a counterattack. I'll block this one instead. Blocking the non-real Zed, in this case, actually stops him from purifying it to keep it alive. I think a lot of people have a habit of blocking the real one, and you often will get value out of doing that. But in this case, we shut down like one of his option plays, which is nice. Because he can't get value out of Purify otherwise, right? So, we save for Pursuit. Like, look at how we're playing this game. Like, even this is a mirror matchup, so it's kind of dumb. But even outside of this mirror matchup, this is how we would be playing. We're thinking about everything it could have, and we're playing pretty safe, not overly safe. If we had pursued last turn, we would have actually been put in a losing position if he had his own pursuit. Now, sometimes that's a risk you have to take. I feel like I'm ahead enough because I had a better hand, in this case, to not have to take that risk. And what that allows me to do is shove into him like this, right? So, we took the Relentless Pursuit when he couldn't counter with either his pursuit or deny. We're going to immediately counterattack, and we have the open attack starting next turn. That's the big deal, right? We have the open attack starting next turn, and there's nothing he can do about that. Because now it's our turn. So again, we're going to make sure we're thinking about every answer, any way he can basically stop us from doing crazy things here. What's the biggest threat he could play? Well, he's going to have a total of 6 plus 2 mana, or 8 total mana. The deck doesn't run Will, or at least the net deck version doesn't, although you could run Will in this kind of thing. The scary thing is Spirit's Refuge, basically. Okay, Blade Scout is a good blocker here. But yeah, the scariest thing overall is going to be Spirit's Refuge, right? that's going to be kind of the one way to threaten this entire situation, because if he has Spirit's Refuge, he will be able to potentially heal his Zed. Now, he doesn't have an elusive blocker. I think I can develop this position. I don't think I have to open attack here after he played the Blade Scout and after I drew the Shadow Assassin. Let's go ahead and look at what the options for him are if we're going to go ahead and develop. Like, how could he punish our development? He could play an elusive blocker. That's not really that big of a deal. He could play Cythria, which is a big body, but she still can't block our Zed because she's only a 6/6. So we will play the Shadow Assassin here. Now, we do have the ability to stop his elusive blocker if he decides to play one. Most importantly, the Shadow Assassin makes the Spirit's Refuge really awkward. We're going to put this on the left side of our attack, and it goes left to right, and he's at 1 health. So suddenly Spirit's Refuge is no longer a way for him to potentially survive this attack. Suddenly he needs either his own elusive blocker or a Purify to stop my elusive. And he'd have to Purify pretty much on the declaration of the attack, right? I'm limiting what he could do in response to this.
By my honor, you must die.
So now he's at 4 mana, which means he can't have enough mana for both Refuge and Purify. There's no reason to pre-commit any spells here whatsoever. We're going to go ahead and take our attack with our Shadow Assassin on the left side, and suddenly Purify should be the only way he could stay alive here. So he would have to Purify the Shadow Assassin. That stops him from Spirit's Refuging, and he would lose his entire board. Now, the scary thing is that if he develops another elusive attacker, that could be awkward. But we've got Purifies, so we can remove elusive status from his units. He takes the Purify here, okay? And he will be losing this entire board. So again, we're going to go ahead and think about our play from the perspective of what his potential options could be. We pretty much have to kill the Zed no matter what. And at 2, he has a hard time protecting this Zed. What that would look like, yeah, I mean, Chain Vest and Radiant Strikes don't do it since we have 5 attack. So we're going to threaten this out. This is actually, I will say, this is not how mirrors normally play out. Normally, this is supposed to be like a really, really dumb, just whoever draws the best card matchup. Okay, so he's gotten a situation where he's put us a little low. He's got the Zed open attack, and suddenly we're the one who needs the option here, right? His Zed is gonna come out for attack. His double Purify is actually good there. So we need to top deck something to not lose this game off of his open attack. And we don't. He is good here off of this open attack. That's pretty good. He actually was able to do just a little bit extra there. He survived at 1 health. That's pretty crazy.
Deny me.
And there's no value we can get out of Purify, unfortunately. We can reduce this attack by I think 1, right? Is the only thing we can do. Let me actually double check, but yeah, I mean, we can't actually do anything apart from that. So he gets perfect lethal and he's good. What I'm trying to instill upon you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and give him the GG. What I'm trying to instill upon you guys is the most important mentality. Specifically, the most important thing, and the reason why I kind of wanted to demonstrate it in those games, was the idea of just having the opponent's list up and basically thinking about what they could have, how they're going to counter your play. Now, I do want to say, you don't want to be a timid player. You don't want to play around everything just like out of fear. You need to know when you have the luxury to play around things and when you don't. For example, it is arguable that maybe I should have taken the Relentless Pursuit the turn we had it. It's very possible. I felt I was in a good position, and I still do. I think that gave me best odds at the time. I feel like we were in a pretty dominant position there. He actually had to have a pretty good hand to force us out into a 1 HP victory at the end. But it is arguable that not taking the Relentless Pursuit in that position is a little too timid. And that is a very, very fine line, right, with this deck. Anyway, now that we've kind of shown you guys how the list plays, we're going to go ahead and get into matchup specific tips, okay? So I'm going to break down common matchups, and I'm going to talk about exactly how to mulligan in those matchups, what you have to do, and what you have to avoid. Okay, so the common matchups, let's go ahead and kind of like break it down. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and hit up kind of like the tier list, because these are going to be the most, you know, common matchups that you're typically going to see. So number 1, Karma Ezreal. This is a pretty spooky matchup. It is going to be kind of all over ladder. Now, what I will say about Karma Ezreal, you don't want to mulligan aggressively for standalone. You don't want to kick it out of your opening hands. If you have standalone in the opening hand, you should be looking to kick, you should be looking to keep deny if you have standalone and either Zed or Shadow Assassin, one of your primary buff targets, right? You want to play this matchup pretty aggressively. That's going to be one of the big things. So if you also have either Zed or Solitary Monk, I would keep a Relentless Pursuit in hand even if you don't have standalone, okay? That's how I would mulligan this matchup. This is like where we have to play very aggressive, which is we're keeping Pursuit even without standalone, and we want to play around Will, which is we're keeping Deny if we have both a buff target and standalone, okay? So that's very important. Now, the way you want to play this matchup, you have to play it very fast. You have to play it very aggressive. I would say one of the most important things is making sure you try to get an opportunity to Relentless Pursuit when they are tapped out for Deny. You don't want to let them enable their Deny in this matchup. So getting a Pursuit when they don't have enough mana for Deny is going to be one of the important points. The question is, should you be buffing Zed or Monk in this matchup? Normally, against Ionia, you're a little bit safer off buffing Zed in general, because a lot of the versions of this deck run a lot of elusive blockers. Shadow Assassin is in every version, and Solitary Monk has been starting to be a little bit more popular in versions of this deck as well. And in Solitary Monk versions, they just have a lot of elusive blockers, so you would rather be playing for the buffed Zed in Ionia matchups, okay? So that's going to be kind of the most important breakdown here. You can play a Blade Scout to block a Pickpocket. That's going to be a pretty important thing you want to do. And try to open attack into the Yone turns unless you are in a position where you're kind of behind on your clock. You know, it's turn 7, 8, or 9, and they're still at like 15 plus health. You might have to take developments there. Otherwise, you might just be too behind, and you might just have to hope they don't have Yone. That's about it. I would say that's kind of like the most important thing in that matchup. Oh, shit. I forgot to mention. Sorry, I missed one thing on the mulligan. You keep Chain Vest as well if you have a primary buff target. I would pretty much be leaning towards keeping Chain Vest in this matchup. It just does so much work against Mystic Shock, Get Excited, and Static Shock. Sorry, I should have put that earlier. Okay, so that is the Karma Ezreal matchup, and it's actually it's very, very similar to the Heimer Karma matchup. At the end of the day, these decks are really similar. They're not really that different. They run a few cards different. Everything I just said about that matchup applies to this one as well, except respecting Yone, because this version doesn't run Yone, but it is almost the same deck. Okay, Karina Control. How you play against this deck with, you know, our deck. So what that's going to mean, you're going to keep Chain Vest. Typically, Chain Vest is going to be your keep against P and Z in general, for kind of the same reasons. You know, they run a lot of Get Excited and Static Shocks. Here, it's even good against Vile Feast and Withering Wail too. Bonus points. Damage that is reduced by any amount on Drain effects doesn't get healed. So Chain Vest stops Vile Feast from healing, and it makes Grasp only heal for 2 instead of 3 if they use it on the target. And of course, most importantly, a barrier will stop Grasp from healing altogether. And that is really, really important. And that's often how you're going to be powering down this deck. So in this matchup, it's kind of the same thing. You want to keep Deny if you already have the buff target and standalone. The reason you do that is because of Vengeance. But if I don't already have a buff target and standalone, I would not keep Deny in the opening hand. Right? You want to play this very aggressively, and unlike the other matchup, this is one where you would prioritize keeping and buffing Solitary Monk instead of Zed, because they run a lot of spiders, the chump blockers, they don't run elusive blockers. So we're going to be focusing on buffing Monk in this matchup and not Zed, okay? And other than that, it basically is going to mulligan the same way as you would against like any control deck. You're going to be usually kicking a lot of tools like Shadow Assassin. Fiora and Shadow Assassin are pretty close to being kept. But again, keep in mind, do not keep Blade Scout or Green Glade Duo in your opening hand. Those are just kind of like supplemental tools that you can play later for value. Sometimes you have hands where you play Green Glade Duo on 2. Sometimes you standalone her. That's fine, but just don't keep them in the opening hand, okay? Now, in terms of how to play this matchup, this is actually one of the better matchups for this deck. This is like, I have never really had a problem with this matchup. One of the difficult positions is whether you deny Brood Awakening. Usually I don't if I have a developed strategy. The only question is, can you beat a Vengeance, right? Can they race you down? If I have 2 denies, I'll happily deny a Brood Awakening, because sometimes that can be a lot of aggression and they can race you down. If I have a Zed on board because I didn't draw Monk, I'll happily deny a Brood Awakening. So ultimately, it just comes down to like where you're going to be using that piece of your toolkit. You're usually not going to get pretty much any value out of Purify in this one specific matchup, but this matchup feels great, so that's fine. Okay, moving right along, we've got the Elusive Burn Mirror. So how do we play this matchup? So we're going to mulligan, as you saw in that third game, we mulligan super aggressively for Zed and standalone. Almost nothing else matters. If we have Zed and standalone, then we can start like keeping certain cards like Relentless Pursuit or Twin Disciplines. But at the end of the day, Zed and standalone and Purify, keep Purify, of course, because if they haven't drawn Zed and they're relying on buffing Monk, then Purify is going to be really, really, really high value. It's usually going to play out in a pretty silly way. Usually it just comes down to whoever has drawn better will basically just get a free win, just like right away. And yeah, that's it. That's all you have to do for the mulligan. In terms of playing it out, yeah, just remember, like, you want to be purifying a big standalone monk if you have the ability to. Other than that, usually you're just folding to, like, the bigger Zed standalone, right? Okay. Then we have Bannerman, okay? So Bannerman is a pretty interesting matchup. You actually don't see a ton of, like, Bannerman decks that much on ladder right now. They're still, like, fairly popular. You know, they are pretty present, but they're just not as popular as they used to be. So one of the things about Bannerman is a lot of common versions of Bannerman runs Purify. One Purify is probably a bit more common right now than two. However, it depends, because Bannerman mostly was running Purify as like Bannerman Tech, but now they will definitely be thinking about Purify. And because of that, you want to buff Zed instead of Solitary Monk, right? So we're going to be keeping Zed and not Solitary Monk. We're not going to be keeping cards like Chain Vest, which we only keep for basically the P and Z matchup. And as always, we're going to be kind of hard mulliganing for standalone. This is a matchup where, you know, you are still just going to go off with like the Zed combo. There's nothing really interesting happening in this matchup's mulligan. There's no like special thing for you to keep or a special condition for you to play for. You are just looking to kind of like outvalue them and rush them down. It's Bannerman, so it's pretty much just going to end up being business as usual. One thing I will say, there will be some situations where challenger units will kind of force you to wait until after an attack to develop a card. So make sure you're kind of thinking a turn ahead, and that you can either, if you're going to develop something, make sure you have the ability to protect it for their challenger attack. Otherwise, develop it after their attack. Spiders. I'm going to go ahead and bundle spiders in with aggro in general. There's many different spiders versions, but here is spiders and here is burn, discard, aggro. You want to be keeping Fiora in these matchups. Which is the one time where it's very important to keep Fiora. She's a good aggression stabilizer, especially with like one Chain Vest. She can basically force them to remove her or win the game. And when they start using their Mystic Shots on your units, aggro decks kind of can't win anymore. When aggro decks are in a position where they start using Mystic Shots on units and playing into defensive spells, their odds of winning just tank. They have a really, really hard time winning at that point. I will often in these matchups just play stabilizer and opt to standalone a Fiora over other targets, or you can race them down with a solitary monk that you basically will always get big value out of. I would keep a Purify against Draven Spiders, or any Nox Spiders specifically, because of crowd favorite, but only if I already have a good hand, only if I already have a buff target, like the card that I'm looking for, and probably standalone as well. And of course, Zed is a little bit risky to play in these matchups, much more so Draven Spiders. I wouldn't try to play Zed in Draven Spiders at all. Whereas against like the burn list, it's much closer between Zed and Solitary Monk. But Zed against Spiders of any kind is liable to just get kind of like chumped out and killed. Sorry, I'm just closing some tabs over here. Anyway, then we've got Kinko Elusive. So it's kind of like the old school, kind of like Kinko Elusive style mirror. You're going to see this deck a decent amount. You want to be mulliganing for pretty much all the same things. They do run Will, so keep in mind against Iona decks that run Will, that means we're going to keep Deny if we already have a primary buff target and standalone. We'll keep Deny in a hand like that and protect it from Will. That'll be very nice when that happens. We're going to be keeping Chain Vest if we have elusive cards. And this is a bit of a weird matchup where I actually often would be keeping cards like Shadow Assassin for sure. Just because they're going to give you reliable and sustained value. Shadow Assassin is a keep that you usually do in this deck in the mulligan when you have a decent hand. If you don't really have anything, you often end up mulliganing it away. and trying to find some part of your like kind of combo piece early. But you keep Shadow Assassin when you have a decent hand in general with this deck. If your hand is, you know, you already have some part of your combo, right? But in this matchup, I would pretty much keep Shadow Assassin no matter what. You just want more elusive bodies. You want to be able to win the elusive combat. You don't keep Purify in your opening hand, but in the mid game, you try to save it for like Jeweled Protector value. And as always against Ionia decks, when they have Deny, try to get Relentless Pursuit when they're tapped out under their Deny. Anyway, that is pretty much it. Those are going to be the most common matchups. I know, like, if I wanted to be like hyper thorough, I could talk a lot more about basically other matchups, but that is pretty much going to be it. That is going to be kind of the end of this guide. Those are like matchup plans, and at this point, you know, just know how to mulligan against, you know, mostly against like Ionia and PNZ. They're going to demand different styles of mulligans, when to keep certain cards like Deny, when to keep certain cards like Pursuit, although, you know, don't do that too aggressively, and just make sure you're thinking about every card the opponent could have in their hand and whether you have the luxury of playing around it. Think about it like that, luxury. If you're winning, you want to play around more things. You assume the opponent has a more narrow range of hand than if you're losing. Well, you could say it as more broad. It's different. It's different ways of saying the same thing, oddly enough. Okay, now lastly, I'm just gonna say this is a list that will get you very far in my experience. A lot of people have been, you know, saying, oh, you know, Swim, thanks for the list. I got masters with this list, right? But at the end of the day, sometimes it's not going to work for you. I would recommend giving it a solid chance. Give it like a solid try. Play it for, you know, a couple days, depending on, you know, how long you're spending playing it. And if you want, sorry, I've got the hiccups. If you want more kind of like guide material, there are other videos on this channel. I've been playing Elusives, this deck, for the past like 3 or 4 days on my Twitch stream. So, so some of the videos on this YouTube channel that are releasing around the same time are Elusive deck gameplay videos as well. And I will be linking some of those other example videos in the pinned comment if you want to check out kind of more examples of me playing this deck and talking through my decision making. Or you can, if you have any questions, stop by my stream and ask me. I stream every day, and I will be playing this deck for the next several days, and almost maybe nothing else. I'm really enjoying this deck. I'm having a lot of fun, and you have to play it in a really unique way. So if you want to watch me play and maybe learn how I play against different matchups and different positions, learn how you think about the game, or ask me any question you want answered about how to play the deck, that's where to hit me up. But otherwise, that's it. I've given you the tools. That's my recommendation. This deck is my recommendation to reach masters. It's worked very well for me and very well for a lot of the, you know, the people that it like are kind of like in my Twitch chat that I've recommended the list to are saying it's doing very well for them too. So yeah, that's it. I hope you guys are able to do very well. Let me know after several days, you know, whether it's been a successful climb for you or not, and, you know, good luck. Guys, what's the counter to this deck? I've started seeing it a lot in ladder and I can't stand it. Well, you want to be in colors that can run Purify or Will of Ionia. Those are going to be like pretty good answers to the deck. So that would put you in Demacia Ionia would be good. So running a Demacia Ionia deck, you would want like something that has like combo potential with Purify. Fast decks are good against this because you want to be able to race them down. So like a combo deck in Demacia Ionia that's like very fast would be good against this.